NEPA doesn't just hurt American industry. It doesn't just make the government incapable of carrying out its basic responsibilities, though both of these things are certainly true. But it often ends up hurting the very environment that these laws aim to protect in the first place. But I think we could actually go quite a large step further here. I would submit that if America gets into a war with China over Taiwan, our environmental review processes will have played a major role in forcing the issue. So I wrote my American Affairs article on the US semiconductor industry. Many of you work in politics. There's a good chance you've heard quite a bit about semiconductors or chips recently. They're the lifeblood of the modern economy. Everything from our phones to AI to military technology relies on increasingly advanced chips to function. And so in this way, if you can control the chip making supply chain, you stand a good chance of controlling the rest of the 21st century.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week it is just me, but not for very long. This introduction is just a way to segue you into a live event that we did here in Washington, D.C. during the week of, It was on June 13th is when we did the event with one of our former fellows, now a newly minted policy manager at the Foundation for American Innovation. But before I get to that, be sure as always to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find the backlog of this show and everything else we have cooking as an organization. We have clocked record attendance for AM Fridays, our summer lunch series on Capitol Hill, where you'll get foundational public policy lectures on a whole variety of issues: trade, immigration, foreign policy, China, tech, conservatism, and much, much more. You can still join us. Go to AmericanMoment.org/AM Fridays and fill out the form, and you'll be on the invitation list for that. It's meant for congressional interns and people interning at public policy organizations around DC. You get a free box Chick-fil-A lunch. We highly, highly recommend it. Applications are now closed for all of our fellowships for the year. But if you really want to be a fall fellow, I bet if you send a very apologetic email explaining why you haven't submitted your application yet, we might even consider taking a look at it. We've gotten a lot of great applications for our first fall fellowship. We're really excited to have it. So looking forward to that. But to our business for today, we're big believers that, half of our job at American Moment is just supporting the fantastic people that we've brought to DC. So Thomas Hochman was one of our fellows in the 2023 class of the Fellowship for American Statecraft, and we thought it was really important to help support him as he begins his career as a policy gnome in full here in Washington, D.C., and that's what we're doing with this event. We had a panel discussion called Why We Can't Build Anything, based in part off of Thomas's fantastic article for American Affairs, where he goes into why semiconductor manufacturing is really being bottlenecked by regulations in the Clean Air Act and in NEPA. But we also talk about much more than that: permitting reform, critical minerals, China, competition, trade, and much, much more. It was me moderating the panel along with Thomas taking sort of the lead role in explaining how to frame this issue, along with Santi Ruiz, the senior editor of the Institute for Progress and author of the Statecraft newsletter. Before joining IFP, Santi served as the executive director of Interact, a global community of technologists. He was also a reporter for the Washington Free Beacon, where he covered science and tech stories. And then Mark DiPlacido, who is a policy advisor for American Compass. Before that, he was the deputy policy director on the DeSantis presidential campaign and worked for U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer in the Trump administration. Thomas himself is a policy manager at the Foundation for American Innovation, where he works on regulatory and infrastructure policy. His writing and research has appeared in American Affairs, The Hill, National Review, The New Atlantis, the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and elsewhere. He holds a BS in mathematical sciences from the University of Vermont. We'll go now to Thomas, Santi, and Mark for a fantastic discussion. Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Moment of Truth. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week I'm joined by three fantastic guests here on stage, starting with Thomas Hochman, who is a graduate of the Fellowship for American Statecraft and a newly minted policy manager at the Foundation for American Innovation. And he's going to talk about why we can't build anything. This is an issue area that touches on everything from energy to permitting to zoning, industrial policy, which is the nerd word to watch, and many more things. Thomas, why don't you kick things off for us here?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. So Nick and Saurabh asked if I would talk about my American Affairs article, and I'll discuss the specifics a little bit. But I thought I might also talk about more broadly why our environmental bureaucracy has made it so hard to build things here. And why, by extension, solving this problem really touches so many of the issues that everybody in this room cares about. So take, for example, America's three largest environmental laws. That's the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. All three of these laws were passed in the early 1970s, and over the last 50 years, they've morphed and metastasized such that they now touch not just every corner of American industry, but really every facet of American life. Maybe most famous of these is NEPA, which says that whenever a project involves the federal government, whether that be federal funds or a federal agency or just federal land, the agency responsible has to fill out what's called an environmental assessment. That assessment consistently takes thousands of pages of paperwork and years to complete, despite the fact that more than 99% of the time, it results in what's called a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact, which is to say that the government spends countless millions of dollars and years of its time just to prove that the project was never going to have an environmental impact in the first place. So the consequences of laws like NEPA have been devastating for the US. Just to give you a few examples, America's been looking for a solution to its nuclear storage problem for decades. Nuclear storage and having a solution to nuclear storage is crucial for the nuclear energy industry. A number of states, including California, have de facto bans on building new nuclear plants in the state until the national nuclear storage problem is solved. And it's also just important to nuclear safety more broadly. So after years of deliberating, the US finally landed on a spot in northern Nevada and began the NEPA review process. Unfortunately, 30 years later, it's still embroiled in that NEPA review process, and America hasn't solved its nuclear waste problem. To give you another example, Colorado wanted to expand its interstate, I-70, to improve congestion, to make traffic a little bit better. That NEPA review process took 14 years to add a couple of lanes to the highway. And maybe my favorite example comes from Montana, where the US Forest Service wanted to plan and implement a wildfire protection program. This too required NEPA, and 2 years later, after 2 years of filling out paperwork, half of that forest burned down in a wildfire. So in this way, NEPA doesn't just hurt American industry, it doesn't just make the government incapable of carrying out its basic responsibilities, though both of these things are certainly true, but it often ends up hurting the very environment that these laws aim to protect in the first place. But I think we could actually go quite a large step further here. I would submit that if America gets into a war with China over Taiwan, our environmental review processes will have played a major role in forcing the issue. So I wrote my American Affairs article on the US semiconductor industry. Many of you work in politics. There's a good chance you've heard quite a bit about semiconductors or chips recently. They're the lifeblood of the modern economy. Everything from our phones to AI to military technology relies on increasingly advanced chips to function. And so in this way, if you can control the chip making supply chain, you stand a good chance of controlling the rest of the 21st century. The US used to dominate chip making. For most of the 20th century, it had a near monopoly on the industry. And even as of the late 1990s, after East Asian countries had started to really compete in the manufacturing market, it still had over a third of global capacity. Today, we're down to just 12%. Taiwan, meanwhile, now makes more than 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors, the chips that are critical to cutting-edge technologies. It's for this reason that if and when China invades Taiwan, there's a good chance that we'll end up going to war over a small island in the South Pacific or in the South China Sea. So, given its strategic importance, why is it that we allowed our industry to be hollowed out? Well, much of this, again, was due to environmental review. So the semiconductor industry in the US hasn't historically been subject to NEPA, but it has been subject to a litany of other environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Air Act, much like NEPA, requires an enormous amount of paperwork and extensive permitting timelines. So I sent in one public records request to a semiconductor plant in Oregon, and the Department of Environmental Quality wrote me back and said, hey, sorry, we just can't actually fulfill this public records request because this plant has amassed over 100,000 pages of permitting paperwork under the Clean Air Act over the years. The Clean Air Act also requires that every single time that a manufacturing facility, much like a semiconductor facility, makes a change to its operations, whether that be something truly significant or something as simple as changing out one boiler for a cleaner one, it has to go through a renewed Clean Air Act permitting process. This, on average, takes 6 months to complete. So taken in sum, this has been stifling for American industry that's trying to compete with countries like China who have zero environmental regulations and really nothing holding them back from turning around operations quickly in a pretty fast-paced global environment. Of course, the Clean Air Act has had a number of huge benefits, right? It's caused the most common air pollutants to drop by an average of 70%, which has in turn saved hundreds of thousands of lives every single year. But just because a law has been good on balance doesn't mean that it doesn't have serious issues and backwards incentive structures and misalignments that have built up over the last 50 years. I won't go into all the specifics right now, but I do detail them more in my article. So unlike NEPA, where America would certainly be better off if we just got rid of it, the Clean Air Act, America would not be better off if we got rid of the Clean Air Act. That would be a bad idea. Nevertheless, in a moment of geopolitical competition as intense as this one, with the stakes as high as they are, figuring out how to better align these environmental and economic imperatives will be crucial. It's not just NEPA, it's not just the Clean Air Act. You could go down the line really of all of America's environmental laws. What would have been America's 2 largest cobalt and nickel mines, which again, critical materials whose supply chain China dominates, saw their leases revoked over a contested Clean Water Act permit. The National Historic Preservation Act was responsible last year for blocking a $10 billion transmission line. And the Rivers and Waters Act of 1899, an 125-year-old law, has been responsible for blocking offshore energy development in the last year. So perhaps the main reason that we can't build anything here in America is our environmental bureaucracy. And if there's one thing that I want to impress on all of you, it's that this is an issue that touches every single issue that any of us care about. So if you're somebody who cares a lot about the people in middle America who have been left behind by the modern economy and the American government, our environmental rules, which have caused the heavy industries which once brought jobs to these areas to move to other countries, matter. If you're somebody who wants America to practice realism in their foreign policy, restraint on the global stage, you don't want to get into a war with China over Taiwan, our environmental regulations matter. So thanks again, everybody, for being here, and looking forward to talking more about all this with Santi, Mark, and Saurabh.
So Santi, you have a newsletter called Statecraft that dives into a lot of these issues. It seems to be that there's a lot of interest from all sorts of people in American life and building things here again. I would be curious for your perspective on how much of a role do these environmental regulations play in our malaise, or is it overdetermined? Is Thomas, talking his book too much? Do you think he's right?
He's not talking his book too much. There is a debate, especially with folks further on the left, on the conservation, environmental protection side, about how bad is NEPA specifically compared to other things for building. I think it's a rich debate. I think we're right. Thomas and Mark are right. But it is worth getting into. I think the problem with this debate, as Thomas has pointed out in some of his work, it's very hard to measure the negative. It's very hard to measure the project that never got built. You can see this mine took 4 years longer than an equivalent mine in Australia. That's easy, but you can't see the costs of regulatory uncertainty for business. And this is like an incredibly unsexy topic, but I think it's kind of the key here. NEPA costs a lot in time for, just straightforwardly, and compared to other rich countries. It costs a lot for agencies. It means our agencies are less good at doing other things because they're paying lawyers, or you're hiring more lawyers rather than other kinds of agency experts. But uncertainty is the other problem. With clean air and clean water, at least the benefit you have is there's a number. This has to be below some parts per million, et cetera. It might be good, it might be bad, and I think Thomas makes a good point that there's a lot of specific things in there that you'd want to ratchet one way, or processes you'd fix. But at least there's we're arguing about an object level thing. With NEPA, if you're thinking about, say, a geothermal project and you're debating whether to do it, you don't know in advance, will this take 4 years and X million dollars, or will it take 12 years and then get slammed by the courts and we never get it? So that, the creating like a hurdle rate for project finance, if you're a startup and you're trying to decide, do we pursue this or the less interesting emerging technology, the fact that you can't actually even plug that into your decisions has this, there's the dark matter of NEPA, that you don't know what you lost as a result. So when you're kind of debating this, and we're talking about, is NEPA the real problem? Is it one of these kind of smaller or a local regulation? I think you can argue about the effects of a California regulatory regime versus national level. But I think whatever number you're seeing, there's this, this like the iceberg below the surface of projects that you never saw, that you were never able to get into the ground. So I think that's just worth, as a framing question, whatever number you see for like, oh, this is the time cost, this is the agency cost. There's all the stuff that we never tried because you just didn't know in advance, is this worth a bet from a finance or an industry perspective?
Mark, you spent time with Ambassador Lighthizer, who's obviously very interested in trying to make sure that we make things right here in America. Seems like the tariffs and preventing foreign imports is one side of the equation, but if we can't make anything here, what's the point of it? What are your thoughts on this issue?
No, I think it's been interesting, really, just in the last 2 or 3 months, seeing the Biden administration have to do kind of a hard pivot on most of their approach to clean energy policy. I think it's been realized that you can't really sell the American people on transitioning to a China-dominated energy future when really our natural resources and our energy sources are one of the biggest comparative advantages we have in this country. So, with the IRA, right off the bat, you saw 60% of the funding going to foreign-controlled countries and as much as $8 billion going to Chinese-controlled countries, or China-controlled companies. Obviously Ford was trying to partner with CATL, a Chinese company, on batteries, and that got a lot of political pushback. But it highlights how far behind we are on a lot of these industries. And I think it's an interesting example using batteries because, the United States with advanced manufacturing went from a $60 billion surplus in the 90s to a negative $200 billion deficit. And we're sort of down the line now where it was fine to get rid of consumer electronic production 20 years ago, but the batteries that go into all of those electronics are now transformed into this huge geopolitical issue with EVs, where batteries that may dominate the automotive industry for the next couple decades. We've just lost the technology, we've lost the competitive edge, and you see that down the line with technologies where things we invented, things we invested billions of dollars to develop, have now gone to foreign countries that make them even better than we do, and now we're playing catch up. So I think permitting on the basic natural resources side is a huge component, obviously, of batteries that go into everything from vehicles, but computer chips, advanced weapon systems, the things that fuel the 21st century economy. And it was a decision to let those industries go abroad and to let the innovation go with it. And we're at a point now where if you want to do a big transition, whether it's green or just focusing on what's actually in our national interests and what's good for the American people, we have to remember that everything we enjoy now, it came at decades of investment and ingenuity, and it wasn't free, and it won't sustain itself.
So I want to ask a kind of series of questions, just unpacking a bunch of stuff, and you guys should feel free to pipe in whenever you want. But I guess I'll pose this to Thomas first. It seems like Schumer was making noises about being interested in permitting reform, and that all went kaput. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going on with that? Was it always a fake sort of thing? Was it real? And just lay out the details for our audience who might not be aware.
Yeah, I don't think it was always a fake sort of thing. But the thing about permitting reform is that it's one of those issues that, because there's bipartisan agreement that we should get it, we never get it, because it can't be a bargaining chip. So Manchin and Barrasso were trying to come together with this permitting reform package on the Senate side, and but the Democrats said, "Oh well, you want regulatory reform. You're the Republicans who want to cut red tape. So we want this transmission line siting law to get passed with it." And the Republicans said, "Hold up, NEPA reform is largely a barrier to clean energy. This is a climate thing. So we want to open up more natural gas leases." Both parties said, "Absolutely not. We're not going to do that." And so nothing ever happened. So my sense is the most recent collapse.
And what was that permitting reform going to be? Was it going to be reforms to NEPA, Clean Air Act? What was it going to touch on?
It was going to be mostly NEPA.
Okay.
People were floating a sort of a very small Clean Air Act reform in there as well. But I don't really think it ever actually got to the point where something very specific had congealed. But But yeah, that's the main reason why is because everybody agrees on it, we never get it.
I'll just add, I think that's all true. I think, like Thomas is hinting, any permitting reform package that we're likely to see move, in my sense, is going to involve a trade of some largely NEPA reforms for some giving up of state control over transmission siting, and that's going to be the pill that folks on the right are going to have to swallow.
Why is that? Why is that issue so totemic, and can you unpack it a little bit?
Just in brief, we're building a bunch of energy across the country, but to get it to where it's needed, you need a lot more transmission lines. And there's some upgrades you can do on existing lines, but you're going to need just new lines that carry energy from, hopefully, inshallah, big geothermal plants in the American West to, wind in the Northeast to, there's different load at different times created, and you're going to need to connect it. But you have to do that, you're going to have to deal with a bunch of states and local jurisdictions, all of which get a say in our current process. So Dems want to remove some level of local control there. At IFP, our view is that's probably a good enough trade if you can hash out the details in exchange for basically unblocking all of this.
And Republicans' terms of opposition to it is purely state control?
Largely a federalism question. There's little details about what control you want to give different federal agencies, but basically it is you lose some federalism on transmission. And there's some proposals where maybe the feds can give you a target for transmission capacity as a state, and states and locales get to decide how do we hit that? What do we renovate? What do we build new?
Is there a concern that by ceding control on these transmission lines to the feds, that they would then also be able to put caps on the ability to build new ones, and this will ultimately be a way to empower Dems to restrict energy production? We
don't build transmission lines anymore. So I don't know that, maybe that's a future concern, but the status quo is they don't get built. Yeah. So that's the big, if you want cheaper energy because Texas is pumping, or you want cheaper energy because you think the American West is going to hit geothermal huge in the next 10 years, you're going to need to move that from the rig to your house. And we just don't have the capacity right now.
Yeah, I would just say the very short version on why Democrats care about transmission so much is they passed the IRA, which sent hundreds of billions of dollars towards building solar panels in the desert, and then they realized that they needed to move those electrons somehow, and here we are.
So let's talk about the IRA a little bit. Dem industrial policy, I keep hearing in the news that this is one of the great achievements of the Biden administration. Is it all that? And can we trust them to actually lead on making it so we can build things in America again?
I can start.
Yeah.
I think it's been really funny watching the so-called abundance agenda crop up on the center left, because the sorts of things they advocate for, at least nominally, are things that you would have expected to come from the center right. Things like cutting red tape and deploying as much infrastructure as quickly as possible. And so,
but it's not Republican coded, therefore it's good.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I mean, I think the vibes are all fun on the center left about, hey, we should go build more things. Yeah. But then they have to deal with this coalition to the left of them that absolutely does not want to reform NEPA or think about how to tweak the Clean Air Act or whatever.
Can you talk a little bit about that coalition? How is the Dem-coded opposition to permitting reform and reforms along all these environmental regulations actually organized?
Yeah. I know you think a lot about this, but there's sort of the emergent debate among the left between the kind of conservationist left, which is the more old school left, and the climate left, who wants to deploy a lot of infrastructure. So you have the Sierra Clubs of the world, who emerged before people were talking about climate change, for example, and that's still very much the way that they think about the world, which is degrowth, pretty explicitly. The way that we solve environmental problems is by stopping us from building more things and blocking infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have a lot of young people on the kind of climate left, often center left, who just want to build a ton of solar panels in the desert or wind turbines in the Midwest. And I don't think that either group has quite reckoned with the fact that the so-called environmental movement is no longer one singular thing. And in fact, the two sides of the environmental movement are splitting rapidly. So that's where the Democratic Party is right now.
No, and another element of that too is the EV question, right? I mean, the way the left has decided to handle this is to basically mandate that 2/3 of our vehicles be EVs in the next 8 to 10 years. And the cost of updating our transmission lines which would basically entail, Mark Mills at the Manhattan Institute has done a lot of great work on this, basically $1 trillion of investment over the next 10 years. And the complete replacement of charging units obviously are sort of the first one that comes to mind, but a lot of these will be charged in people's homes. So people who don't have single family homes with garages, the infrastructure to replace all the transmissions and the lines that go to those is going to be massive, and it's going to have an environmental toll, and it's going to have a real cost.
Yeah, and what's the plan for people who park their cars on the street?
One thing I'd just add to the question of like what is the coalitional split on the left is NEPA is the kind of the Greens' big win in American environmental history. NEPA is like the one clear success case for the groups.
As it's played out,
70s.
like they wanted it to take 14 years?
Well, it's the tool that they have, and so litigation in courts over big projects that they don't like, whether it's clean energy that crosses the sage grouse lands or it's oil and gas. That's the best tool in the arsenal for these groups. And so even folks, I think, on that wing of the Democratic Party who see the trade-offs have a hard time with the idea of giving up the tool that's worked for 50 years for stopping projects you don't like. So there's a cultural challenge as well. On our end, I think there's a challenge because the folks who love cutting regulation and the folks who love industrial policy and state capacity are not always the same people on the GOP side. And so this is an issue that codes kind of Grover Norquist, cut red tape. And I think the challenge for folks like us is to make the case that this is a very important, clear national interest Taiwan story, as well as it would be nice for businesses if it was easier to build things.
So this was going to be my next question, is that, I've been in this game for a couple of years now, and it feels like when I first got involved, it was like, which galaxy brain, new term, like complicated novel policies that would make Grover Norquist's hair catch on fire can we come up with? And it's like more and more every day that passes, it's like, dear God, I sound like a normie. I'm talking about energy production and cutting red tape, and isn't this all quite lame? Make your case for why the people interested in the galaxy brain policy should care about these ultimately like very normie things. Does it have to be the first step towards any more creative, broader agenda? Like, is it all dead on arrival unless we get the basics of energy production and basic permitting and regulation right?
I mean, yeah, I don't want to be controversial here, but I'm for good things and against bad things. And so, the thing about regulations is like, J.D. Vance, right, who is undeniably not a Grover Norquist type, talks all the time about the industries that once were in Ohio that brought good jobs to the state, right? J.D. Vance would also undeniably say that like our regulatory bureaucracy is one of the reasons that those industries have left. Those industries would say that as well. And so, you can frame it in the context of, oh, well, like the most boring center-right presidential candidate goes up there and talks about slashing red tape for 45 minutes or whatever. But you also could frame it in the context of, okay, but actually when we drill down and think about the issues that we care about the most, what are the underlying reasons that there have been failures? And regulations are one of them.
No, and I'd add to that, like the point of the new right is not to just be reactionary against the old right. There's obviously frustrations and
I should write that down somewhere.
like the paradigm, needs some updating, but a lot of it is addition, not just subtraction and not just shifting. And I think part of the basis of conservatism has always been common sense. And when the left spends 3 years of a presidential administration loading more requirements on our electric grid, while at the same time issuing new regulations that limit the ability to create new power plants or to use efficient energy to power them. At the same time, we're trying to scale up artificial intelligence, Bitcoin. There's all these new technologies that all have unprecedentedly new demands on the power grid. That are even outpacing the innovation we've had to make our grid more efficient. So to do that at the same time that the left is still issuing all of these, the same old standard environmental restrictions, on the other end, you have two sides of the administration, like on several other issues, that are working against each other and ultimately against the American people. I think the dominant story or the dominant policy concern for Americans last year, and still a majority this year, is inflation. And the biggest enemy of the poor is expensive energy, because it's an input in literally every single thing we do. And even if you want to be a bleeding heart liberal about it, there's still millions of people in the world who live in energy poverty. And the more rooted we get in this, eliminate emissions at all costs, that has implications for production around the entire world. So I think it's a humanist element, or there's a humanist argument for it too. It's not just like to fuel our war machine against China or to be selfish Americans. Like, cheap energy is good for everyone.
So on the trade competitiveness side, especially, Mark, do you see this as an essential component? Like, we really can't start to ramp up an aggressive onshoring and reshoring agenda via tariffs or other mechanisms unless we get this part right, because it just will mean that we're not getting it from China, but we're also not getting it here because we can't make it here?
No, absolutely. Like I said, I think energy is one of America's strongest competitive advantages. And, if I were...
It's one that China doesn't have. They have to import a lot of theirs.
Right. And I think the first thing I would do in an energy department of a Republican administration would be to keyword search climate change in every single executive guidance that's been given and change it to energy dominance, because that should be the mindset. It's how can we produce the most energy, the most efficiently, and the most reliably, both to be competitive with our enemies and to provide the American people with the best livelihood we can. And even, you can look at the Russia situation too and see where they have picked up the slack where we've abandoned it. So even more traditional hawks should really care about this issue.
So I can imagine an objection that's going to emerge potentially, especially in the coming years, is that a major goal of Republicans is going to be to unwind this green energy agenda that the Inflation Reduction Act especially really pioneered. A lot of the political energy for permitting reform is coming from the fact that we need permitting reform in order to implement that green agenda. I think it's perfectly reasonable from their partisan point of view for Republicans to say, yeah, we're going to do permitting reform, but we're also going to get rid of these green incentives. Does that instantly shatter the political coalition to actually get this done? How are you thinking about the game theory dynamics of this in the coming years, especially if there's unified Republican control of Washington?
I don't have a crystal ball. I think it's a risk, and I think people are gonna have to think about what do they value and what's worth trading. And Matt, I think there is still, maybe I'm a hopeless optimist, I think there's a trade, even leaving aside IRA repeal, on transmission lines and permitting reform, in part because there's folks on both sides of both aisles on both issues who think that that's value for money, and if you just want cheap energy for the American consumer, you probably need bits of both of this. Whether or not you hack away at big subsidies that you're rolling out for EVs, say. Maybe that's the incorrigible optimist in here. I think there's, to Thomas's point, there is real bipartisan sense. You could get 60%, 70% of both houses to say, yeah, we need permitting reform, and then the devil's in the details.
Yeah, I mean, by the time, if Trump wins in November, something like more than $100 billion or something of the Inflation Reduction Act money already will have gone out the door. So the task of actually getting that clean energy money converted into clean energy infrastructure is something that the Democrats are still going to be wanting to capitalize on. And for that, you're going to need NEPA reform, permitting reform more broadly. I don't know if that's enough to continue to bring them to the table, but like Santi, I'm a hopeless optimist and hope we can make it happen.
Fantastic. We have time for several questions. The nerdier, the better. Let's see. I saw Wyatt raise his hand first. There's a mic coming to you right there.
So my question is obviously for the board, but it is inspired by Mr. Hochman's excellent piece in American Affairs. Very, very good read. Obviously, in the piece, it's sort of the programs that draw the ire are obviously specifically NEPA, CWA, Clean Water, Clean Air Act, and I believe RCRA and CERCLA, and for good reason. Obviously, these are horrifically inefficient permitting regimes. My question is, have you guys given any thought to the Endangered Species Act as well? Because I feel like I've seen this fact pattern play out in the 1,000 Tennessee Valley Authority cases that exist, where there's a very, very big industrial project that's coming to often a poorer part of America. I'm thinking about Appalachia, that is shut down because there's some trout, some animal, right? That is having its habitat infringed upon. So my main question is, have you guys thought about that, and do you think that that's a gut completely thing, or is that a reform, maybe getting rid of like the citizen suit provision, something like that? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, all of these environmental laws need attention. Maybe my call to arms for anybody who works as a staffer is, these laws have gotten very little attention. NEPA is really the only one that has gotten attention. And by the way, like as it should, it is the mother of all environmental regulations. But there are, many, many, many environmental laws that impact development in one way or another. As to the what to do with the ESA question, no, we should not gut it. Call me a squish, but like I like the whales and the sage grouse, and I would be sad if they were gone. And it is part of America's history and its heritage to care about America's natural environment as well. So yeah, we're all about finding inefficiencies and balancing, right, both the things that we actually set out to protect in the first place and also Americans.
Just to add, the reason the argument against NEPA is so easy is that's purely procedural. There's not somebody getting a win on one side of it, except for the groups that just want to block a project in toto. And so the argument there is easy. Like neither the Greens who want to protect the sage grouse or the sunny trout or whatever are getting a win. At least on substantive regulations here, somebody is getting what they want, and then we can have like a normal political argument over like where should that line be, what should we be protecting. So I think, yeah, just because the argument against NEPA is easier because it's clearly just like it's a subsidy to lawyers, doesn't mean that the other ones are not a problem for building. It's just you're going to have to get more in the details and figure out like what should the line actually be. It's easy for me to sit here and say like we just shouldn't like use the IRA to fund lawyers to argue in courts. Like that's a terrible use of doesn't get you anything for money.
Just on the question of geography. One interesting element of all of this is it seems like a lot of the new industrial production in the United States, to the extent it's coming online, is in the Sun Belt and not in the Rust Belt. It's not in the parts of the country that had a lot of the manufacturing and frequently long and uninterrupted liberal control. It's bright red states. What do you guys make of that dynamic? Do you think that's only going to continue?
I think I would weigh in here.
No, I mean, I've just, and thinking about environmental policy or energy policy more generally, I think the left fights on both, the federal and the state level, and I don't think it's unreasonable for conservatives to operate the same way. If we want more nationwide production of something, if we, especially around issues like critical minerals, rare earth minerals, where we need it for our national security or we need it for the dominant industries of the 21st century, we can't let specific states totally jawbone the entire country. Similarly with pipelines, right? You have a situation in the Northeast United States where they won't allow any natural gas pipelines. So, blue collar families in New Hampshire have to import sometimes natural gas from Russia instead of Pennsylvania that's sitting a few hundred miles away. And I think that just, whether you jawbone it under the Commerce Clause, I'm not sure, but I think it's kind of an absurd situation that we've kind of let go on too long.
I'll just say, I think you're totally right. And producing more things in the U.S., especially energy, like the stuff we've been talking about here, may or may not overlap with the good goal of revitalizing the Rust Belt. But I wouldn't assume that, as you pointed out, a lot of these jobs are in the Sun Belt. If we can reduce kind of the regulatory barrier to geothermal, that'll be largely the American Mountain West. I would love to see a world in which revitalizing American production means that the Rust Belt is restored to kind of its former dominance. It's not obvious that it will be the case, and I don't think we should give up on any ideas that are great ideas because they don't do that one good thing.
I think the new jobs, what's important is that the new jobs will be a similar skill set to the ones that were lost, and we'll have a more natural distribution across our population based on, interest, skill sets, especially with, prime age males.
Fewer fake email jobs.
Exactly. And if people had to move for those, it might be a little more compelling than like taking a service job somewhere.
Or learn to code.
Yeah.
And I mean, I just wanted to say, I agree with everything that's been said, and it's true that energy production and energy infrastructure will largely be concentrated in just a couple of regions, but manufacturing industries more broadly, which could also stand to benefit from regulatory reform, could be more widely dispersed, right? So I mean, there's a massive new semiconductor plant in Ohio. That's right. This is one of the areas that has been left behind. So it is true that we can't kid ourselves about what exactly restoring domestic industry will do for the Rust Belt. Nevertheless, it'll still help.
Next question. Lars.
Lars from SPC. Yeah, thank you. Lars from SPC now. I have a question about the IRA. I'll start with Thomas. So let's say that Trump wins in 2025. What do you see as the conflict at the state level, considering it's largely ruby red states that are benefiting from the Inflation Reduction Act, and the newly incoming administration that, for understandable reasons, might want to get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think some people have written about this conflict. My sense, and I'd be curious to get Mark's take as well, but my sense is that the first credit on the chopping block for Republicans are the EV tax credits. I'm not necessarily confident that the production tax credits and the investment tax credits are going to be repealed. Maybe they will be, but I think more likely the focus will be, at least at the beginning, on the EV credits. I also don't think that the red states that are getting a lot of IRA money are necessarily benefiting as much from those credits. So maybe I don't know, maybe those two goals aren't as orthogonal as they may seem. But yeah, I would imagine that some states that have benefited a lot from the ITCs and PTCs, those investment and production tax credits, will be eerily silent as the federal level GOP tries to take down those credits. But yeah, it'll be, I don't have a crystal ball, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I guess my comment on that, with respect to the EV stuff in particular, I think the approach of trying to fill in the incentive on the back end at the consumer level obviously created no barriers from that money flowing to foreign controlled vehicles, right? Which had to have the backlash. They shortened the list of vehicles. I think it's very much an open question whether EVs are going to have the same market in America as they do in China, and even to a certain extent in Europe, and also another open question of whether the investment it would take to catch up to China at this point would be worthwhile. But even if it were, right, I think what Thomas was pointing to, if you were going to do the industrial policy right, it would be focusing on the front end of the development of those vehicles. And when you have Biden basically exclude the production credit for any extraction or any mining for the minerals that go into batteries, like that's the most important place to start. And the rest of it really doesn't make sense if we're still sourcing 80% of battery components and or more from China.
Huggins.
I guess I wanted to add to Wyatt's question. So what is a good, especially in the case of the Clean Air Act, what is a pragmatic or realistic way of reforming the law without eliminating it, of course?
Sure. Well, part of this depends on whether or not you can get Congress to act. Right. But here's the thing, right? So I wrote that American Affairs article under the assumption that Congress won't act. And the beautiful thing in this case about the federalist structure of the Clean Air Act. So states and state departments of environmental quality are responsible for the permitting process for the Clean Air Act. This is different from NEPA, where it's executive agencies. And sometimes it's county departments of environmental quality, but we won't go there. Actually have a fair bit of leeway to figure out how they want to implement the Clean Air Act permitting process. So a state can put together a plan, and then they have to go to the EPA and get it signed off on. So a couple things. First of all, there is and we're getting really wonky here, so apologies in advance to everybody who doesn't want to listen through this. There is, maybe the number one thing is that states can pass what's called a flexible permitting option. So in the early 2000s, the EPA basically designed this flexible permitting thing, which says that instead of going through a renewed Clean Air Act permitting process every single time you change your operations, which is what currently happens, we'll just set a limit on the amount that you can emit from your facility or your plant. And as long as you can demonstrate continuing compliance with that limit, you don't need to go through a new permitting process when you change out one boiler for another. That would make a huge difference. But the problem is most states haven't even written it into their plan. So to give you an example of a success story here, when they were testing out this pilot program in Oregon, actually, Intel, at the end of these 5 years, said we made something like 200 changes to our facility that would have otherwise required a renewed permitting process. 200 times 6 months, you do the math, right? But I was interviewing a former EPA guy under Trump, and he said, there's that old Yogi Berra quote, which is, nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded. This is the opposite. Nobody's going there anymore because nobody's gone there. And so there's an uncertainty about the efficacy of this approach because there's something like 50 flexible permits total that have been used around the country. I think the other issue here is that the EPA technically is supposed to take a year or less to sign off on that new state plan, but nobody enforces this. So Texas tried to pass a flexible permitting program, and the EPA took 16 years before they said no. And Texas had just said, okay, we're sick of waiting. We're just going to start issuing these flexible permits. And then when the EPA said, because 10 years in, I think you just kind of assume that the EPA is going to be cool with it. And so all of a sudden, these plants were left in limbo because EPA said you can't do this anymore. Now, Texas contested that and then ended up winning in the circuit courts. But this just gives you an example of, I think, why a number of states are reticent to write it into their plan in the first place. The other thing is a number of states have them, but have added additionally complicated permitting language on top. So New York is one of these states where they say you can use PALs, but also if you don't reduce your emissions by a certain percentage, 25%, right? There you go, 25%, within 5 years, your PAL is gone. Well, that's not really the point. PAL is the name of a flexible permit. That's not really the point of a flexible permit, right? So there are a number of overlapping issues, but I think that flexible permitting option has shown to be really effective, and it's an option that states have, and that's pretty unusual with environmental laws, right? That even without Congress doing anything, we can make the status quo a lot better.
One thing I'll just add that's like an interesting theme here that carries over to NEPA and other cases is requiring executive agencies to take less time on this stuff is, I think, generally just it's not going to do the thing you want it to do. A, because there's no enforcement, you can't tell EPA pay us money. And in a lot of these cases, especially the ones that are litigable by private citizens, so like NEPA cases, if you tell, say, the Forest Service, you're capped at a certain number of a year to finish your your EIS, your environmental impact statement, or your EA. That may itself be cause for litigation from a private citizen. You say, like, they rushed it and they left out this thing that was included last year in theirs, so clearly they didn't do a full environmental review. So you want to be really careful just telling agencies, do this or don't do this. In my view, a lot of what you want to do for NEPA is just put a time limit on injunctions. Say, like, look, you can only hold these things up in the courts so long, or cumulatively between the agency and the courts, you can only block a project for, say, 4 years, which is still crazy, but like, let's just start there. But as with clean air, you want to be really careful not to just say, okay, well, we told the agency not to spend a long time on this stuff anymore. The problem is like the incentive structures that this creates.
No, and that's a huge way. Environmental groups get funding from taxpayers just through suing these agencies who don't, follow the law exactly, and whether it's coordinated or not, I don't know, but they call it sue and settle, and it's been going on for a long time. I think the litigation point is key on that as well. Limiting the window of litigation would be a big saver, and even maybe the standing that certain groups would have to sue in the first place. That'd probably be another layer of reform on top of the limited reforms that were included last year.
Last year, the Center for Biological Diversity made 25% of its money from damages from lawsuits, just to give you a sense of how much money they make.
Good work if you can get it. Next question. Over here. Wait for the mic.
So you guys have mentioned critical minerals, cobalt in particular, a couple times up here, and I'm all on board with opening up permitting reform. But with cobalt in particular, we could open that all the way up, and factor in the U.S. only has a supply of about 69,000 tons of cobalt, which is less than 1 year's supply for the U.S. consumption. So, I'm convinced that permitting reform is necessary to make us more competitive and strengthen our access to critical minerals. but I am worried that it won't be sufficient. And I'm wondering if you guys could shed some light on that. What would we need to do to improve our access to critical minerals? Would permitting reform enable us to become self-sufficient in any critical minerals, or is it a more complicated picture than that?
The one thing I'll say, I don't know from cobalt, so grain of salt. But in the geothermal space, we got some small improvements in the package from summer last year on drilling wells on public land. But a lot of what's still missing is like subsurface exploration on public lands, and so there's certain things that we haven't checked. You can't check vast stretches of the American West for useful stuff. Because you run into the same NEPA problems again. So I don't know what's out there, but there's like a easy, even for things that aren't necessarily especially invasive, it's incredibly arduous to try and find out like what resources do we have on, say, BLM land.
The arc of American history doesn't really show the idea that the U.S. has resource shortages with anything. Some farmer in bum whatever nowhere will find like the largest supply ever found.
Some tiny percentage of the subsurface of the U.S. has been mapped, so we really don't know. But let's assume that we just don't find more cobalt. I don't think that anybody's advocating for like pure autarky, where we make every single thing from every single industry here in the U.S. Maybe somebody is, but it's okay to like trade with people that we're friends with, and various countries that are not China have supplies of cobalt, and that's totally fine in my mind. The point is to unlock the resources that we have, and then trade for what we don't.
No, I think that's a really good point. Like quickly on the federal lands thing, like Biden has basically also completely frozen federal land leasing, so that definitely needs to be reversed in the next administration. And also, there's certain groups that are trying to get federal land leases that would go to developers just to sit on it and do nothing. So that also needs to be a requirement that if the federal government is leasing you this land, you have to develop it. That's sort of part of the idea. More specifically on the question of the critical minerals we have here, like that is correct in terms of what we know. The United States does not have, at least from what we know now, the advantage with critical minerals that we do with energy sources that we've used up to this point. And I think it's cobalt, but like an overwhelming majority of the world's cobalt currently comes from the Congo, which is like a pretty horrific situation. And I think that's just something to keep in mind to the extent that large sections of our economy are going to require batteries henceforth. How much more burden do we want to put on that? And I think it is a reasonable, it's a reasonable step back to take when looking at EVs as something we want to dump a ton of investment in, whether the sort of labor conditions over there are something we're going to be okay with.
We have time for one longer question or two short ones. Back there.
Andrew Demisho. A lot of the discussion so far has been about past failures with attempting permitting reform. One of the very few successes I can just think of off the top of my head was part of the debt ceiling deal last year, in which there was, I think, the page limits to environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, and then something about like the designation of like a primary agency for those studies. I guess my thought is, what do you guys think of this? Everybody's discussion at the time appeared to be that this is just a token reform, but I'm curious as to what you think of the spurts of permitting reform we've had so far.
Just real quick, I think having a lead agency is probably a small improvement. The page limit stuff, unless you change litigation, I think it just it pushes the delay somewhere else in the chain to the litigation.
Yeah, 100% agree. Because the problem is that the main reason you get sued with NEPA is that you haven't accurately described all of the potential impacts of your project. And so if you just reduce the number of pages that you can use, you just have less space to describe the potential impacts of a project, and you push it to more litigation.
And you haven't changed the precedent. You can say, oh, in 2015, you guys described this, and you don't hear. So,
yeah.
And a judge ruled that one was incomplete, so clearly this one's incomplete, right?
Yeah.
Final question. Up here.
So, thank you. So Thomas and I have talked a little bit about this before, but I wanted to post it to the group because it's about semiconductors. I have some friends out in the West, I believe it's Utah and also Arizona, TSMC and these other semiconductor companies are starting to open up more facilities, luckily, but it seems like there's been a lot of local resistance because they're bringing in Taiwanese workers to teach people how to run the plants. And these workers groups are getting all mad because they're bringing in foreigners, and there's obviously a learning curve to bring back these industries in the U.S. Is this something that is going to resolve itself on its own, especially if we do relax these permitting rules and we start getting more facilities built? Are we going to have a long-term delay in our own capacity to train and operate these plants? And rely on foreign workers to do that? What does that situation look like?
I mean, just to start off, I guess my initial reaction to that is that China has basically spent the last 25 years having Americans come in there and teach them all of our technology and, taking all of that and starting their own. And unfortunately, with chips, with batteries, with several other industries now, it might look the other way. And this is exactly what happened. I mean, this is what happened with Japan in the 80s, with Reagan too in the auto industry. Japan was like way out competing us. Reagan noticed the trade deficit was starting to tip up and he had to do something about it. So he instituted local content requirements and they started building their facilities here. So I think, it's obviously local communities that have been hammered by globalization and all of these industries shipping overseas, and it's unfortunately the same ones that have to go through certain challenges when you open globalization up the other way, whether it's through low skill immigration, which gets a lot more political attention, but something like high skill immigration, there's going to be bumps. But I think from a larger view of what's in the national interest and what's best for the common good, this is advanced technology that we need to learn more about, and if that's who knows it right now, we manage it the best we can.
I would just say, there's it's going to require some humility to accept, we're in the position that some developing economies in East Asia were in the 70s and 80s, and so that point about learning by doing, I think in the TSMC in Arizona case, the local HVAC union was protesting that they were being replaced to do, AI data center sealing is one of the most complicated technical blue collar pieces of work you can do. I don't think the HVAC union in Arizona had done a lot of this work before. So I think there's some cases where we're going to have to say we want high skilled, we want managers, we want people who can teach this stuff, and we want to learn that, download that in house. But it's going to take a little bit of humility for certain things where TSMC is better than us about this. We're going to have to we're going to have to learn from them. It's going to be tough.
Yeah, I would also take that story with a little bit of a grain of salt. The sort of underlying subtext of that was that, and this is why the TSMC plant is delayed. And then a week later, TSMC said, actually, we're a year ahead of schedule, and it's pretty clear.
Well, wasn't it after their CHIPS Act funding got approved?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was almost 100% sleight of hand to get more money from the CHIPS Act, which was the sort of many people basically think that this was a play to get more money because they were running behind schedule, so they said we need more funds. Then the money came out and they said, oh, look at us, we're actually a year ahead. So I would say maybe that story was a nothing burger.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Please give them a round of applause.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We certainly enjoyed taping it. If you'd like to get on the list for events like this, be sure to fill out our form, americanmoment.org/join, and just indicate that you're interested in being on the list for events like this. We have them all the time, more than I can count. I've been really, really mean to Nick about it. We have way too many of them these days. I can think of at least 2 more upcoming pretty soon here, but we're having a fantastic time. Be sure to join us at National Conservatism Conference this summer, July 8th, 9th, and 10th. If you reach out to us, we can even get you a discount code that'll shave some off the ticket prices. We've got Steve Bannon, Senator J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, Eric Schmidt, Roger Marshall, Stephen Miller, and a bunch of other fantastic people headlining the conference. It's really going to be the conservative event of the year, and it's going to be just a week and a half before the RNC, so a very important time for our country. Be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org and find everything else we have cooking. Sign up for AM Fridays and rate and review this podcast. YouTube has a membership program that you can be a part of as well, where you can be a truther or a statesman. You get the episode 1 day early, as well as access to special members only content that we release most weeks. And be sure to tune in next week for another episode of Moment of Truth. Thank you. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.